Let me tell you a little bit about him, just by way of introduction, not to take up too much of his time, but he was born in Calgary, Alberta, schooled in Alberta, grew up in southern Alberta, schooled in Alberta and Switzerland. He obtained a law degree from the University of Calgary and was a partner in a law firm for some 14 years. During that time, he served as a volunteer, but as president of the Canadian Parks and Wildlife Society, Wilderness Society. Now, he's senior advisor on conservation for that organization. He's also currently the vice president for conservation strategy at the Wild Foundation in Boulder, Colorado. He is the founder of the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which you'll hear a great deal about this evening, of course, and a senior advisor still with the initiative. He's, of course, widely published, a popular speaker really around the world. And in 1999, he was named Time Magazine Canada's one of their leaders for the 21st century. So without further ado, please welcome Harvey Locke.
That was awful kind. As the skier said, it's all downhill from here. Thank you very much, Chuck. Chuck and I had talked about the idea of me coming and having a chance to speak at your wonderful museum a number of years ago, and I can't tell you how big a fan I am of this place. I've been here many times, not as a speaker, just as somebody enjoying it. And the integration of the natural history and the arts and the Aboriginal history and the Western Euro history here is exceptional. And I go to museums all over the world. It's one of the things I get to do. And this place is a very special place, and I'm so honored to be here among you. So what I will try to do tonight is share with you something about this idea, and maybe we can make it just a tad darker so we can have the contrast up.
Yeah, we might lose the light on you in the process, but we can have the voice.
Well, I can be the disembodied voice. How's that?
The voice
Okay. So here we go. Anyway, a great privilege to be here among you, and I'd like to talk to you about wilderness. This is actually where I'm from. This is the boundary of Banff National Park and Mount Assiniboine Provincial Park in the Canadian Rockies. So I'd like to talk to you about these kinds of wild places, wild animals like grizzly bears, wolves, and of course people. And I'd like to talk to you about the importance of a vision. This image is from a guidebook about how to go west in the 19th century. And it's called American Progress, or Progress as we would call it in Canada. And it's there's an original of it in the Autry Museum in Los Angeles. But this is a very interesting image to spend some time with, because it defines what my ancestors were up to when they came west. So here you have Liberty, and she embodies progress coming out of the big cities of the East. In her hand is the telegraph line and the book of knowledge. With her comes the train, the settlers with their plows, the miners, the Conestoga wagons, the Pony Express, and of course, out of the landscape is being chased the buffalo, the Aboriginal people, and the wolves. So out with the old and in with the good. And if you fattened her up a little bit, put a kind of a crabby expression on her face, that'd be Queen Victoria. And that applies perfectly to Canada. It applies to Australia, applies to South Africa, and to some degree even to India. This was the big mental narrative of the 19th century. This is good. But there was another thing went on in the 19th century. This is a Thomas Hill painting, and I want to acknowledge the wonderful collection of art in this museum and the Morans that are just out front. You actually have a wonderful little Moran watercolor right in the hallway here of this same thing, which was profoundly important. This is Romanticism. And Romanticism was another great intellectual movement of the 19th century. And it was a counter-reaction to the ugliness of the Industrial Revolution. And there were poets like William Wordsworth, and there were great artists. The most famous one was Turner from England. But many artists like Thomas Moran or Hill were able to capture the beauty and magnificence of nature. And people wanted to protect the beauty and magnificence of nature in the 19th century too. And so the idea of progress swinging westward and Romanticism, saying nature is beautiful, collided in Yellowstone. And there was born the idea of the national park. This is one of the greatest ideas civilization ever had. Protect a place because it's beautiful and should be left alone. And that was a new definition of progress for that place. And thus began the national park idea in Yellowstone. This is a Thomas Moran painting of the back of the Tetons. Imagine in a black and white world with no radio, television, iPods, nothing, the power of these paintings to bring the color and vibrancy of the West to a landscape in the East, if you've ever lived where the sky's never really fully blue in the same way it is here. Profoundly important. And then, of course, this fellow, Ernest Thompson Seton, and his contemporaries. In the late 19th century, there was no wildlife. I don't mean it didn't exist, I mean it wasn't called that. There was game, which was good, and there was vermin, which was bad. And there wasn't wildlife. It didn't have its own value. And this man, who's kind of like me, a hybrid Canadian who's spent a lot of time in the United States, coined the phrase wildlife. And he wrote books that people read rabidly. He had a huge audience 100 years ago. And the idea that wildlife had its own validity and that it didn't need to be justified by reference to humans' view of it, whether it was game or vermin, but rather it had its own value, was profoundly important to the survival of large mammals in North America, which was razor thin. They almost all disappeared on this continent 120 years ago. The idea of a wildlife refuge also emerged at that time. This is a lovely painting by Tucker Smith of the wildlife refuge in Jackson, the National Elk Refuge. Elk were almost extinguished from the landscape, so they created an elk refuge. And this was all like first time thinking. We should do this for these large mammals. So we ended up with this idea about how to reconcile our desire to save the beauty of nature on the one hand and have our progress on the rest of the landscape. And you can call it the green box. So in the green box you create a national park, like Yellowstone is the classic green box. It's even a box in the map. And there's a range of them. There's national parks, there's wildlife management areas like an elk refuge. Shoshone National Forest on the edge of us, the first national forest in the United States. All these ideas were about saving nature, hanging on to it, and also having progress. Where we are today is we are able to evaluate how effective that reconciliation has been. And I'll take you to Boston. This is the Middlesex Fells Reservation right here in Boston. 1,200 acres. It was when it was established in the 1890s, so the same period. I went and did some original research in the Appalachian Mountain Club's library to see how this was referred to. It was about protecting wilderness outside of Boston. The city of Boston was this big back then. Now the city of Boston completely engulfs it. And so in the 1890s, there was this wilderness reserve primarily set up to protect native plants. And because Boston's had good universities for a long time, somebody went in and inventoried the native plant species in the 1890s. And there were 300 native plant species in this reserve and 17 exotics, or weeds, things you don't want. Then some conservation biologists had the idea to go back in the 1990s and say, well, now that it is surrounded, it's become a de facto island, what does that mean for the plant species? And their research showed that species like this, the wood lily, dropped out of the system. They just disappeared. And that's because they're bulb reproducing species. So if somebody digs them up, or they have a disease, or something else bad happens to them, they have no way of getting back in because it's walled off with city. Similarly, burr reproducing species. So imagine that your dog gets in the burrs and gets them on his fur. Well, that's how they transport their seeds. They've dropped out of the system because there's no fur transporting them anymore because the animals can't get in and get out. The species that are still doing well are the pollinators because they're still connected through the air. So they were down to about 200 native and 30 native plant species and 70 exotics or invasives that have moved in. So through time, that reserve, though well managed, is losing its integrity because it's become an island. So you can say, well, thanks, Harvey, Boston's got problems. We all knew that. If we scale up reserve size a little bit, this is Point Pelee National Park in southern Ontario. It sticks into its wonderfully rich peninsula in Lake Erie opposite Pennsylvania. It's a major stopover for migratory birds, monarch butterflies, and has been a national park for over 100 years. And before that, it was a naval reserve. So it's a pretty intact place. But it's surrounded by tomato fields. Your Heinz tomato ketchup comes from there. And so what does that mean? So it's got this Carolinian forest. Believe it or not, in Canada we have forests that you have in the Carolinas because of the warmth of the lake effect and so on. Very biologically rich. Well, this is what's happened there. It's an island too. It's a peninsula that's been cut off to become a de facto island. This is a survey of amphibians. So think frogs, toads. And you can see, and salamanders. You can see historically all those species were there. In 1972, 3 of them are gone. 1992 survey, half of them are gone. You can't isolate nature from the rest of nature and expect her to survive. That's the message. What if we go bigger to the big reserves we've created, the big green boxes that everyone in the world has heard of, like Yellowstone, which you can see on the map, or Banff and Jasper up here? They're big places. Or this place here in Idaho called the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, which, including the roadless areas, is 8 million acres. Or the Bob Marshall Wilderness and Waterton Glacier here. How do those really big places do? Well, the answer is very, very well indeed. Big, wild, core protected areas are fundamentally successful innovations. We can evaluate this by looking at species of carnivores and ungulates. So carnivores are the big teeth. Ungulates are the horns or antlers and the cloven hooves. There's this wonderful study done by La Liberté and Ripple of their distribution in the past, 14 of these species in the past and in the present. And this study shows what North America was like. This is before Liberty sets off on her mission. So you can see the number of these carnivores and ungulates distributed in North America. And you know, if you're a biodiversity person, the first thing you're going to say is, well, how come it doesn't look more rich in the tropical areas? And the answer is because there's no big animals in the tropics. Us big animals all live in the north. That's why Nordic people are so big. Right? We don't like the heat. Same with large mammals. So if you're talking about large mammals, you don't spend time in the tropics. You spend time in the place where they live. So this is a study of large mammals. They were widely distributed across North America. So see how hot the colors are there, 10, 11, 12 species? There were buffalo in Buffalo, New York. That's why it's called that. And there were grizzly bears on the Great Plains. Lewis and Clark's journals are full of it. And you can see what's happened is the colors have gotten remarkably cool down to the point of 0. This is the great corn and grain belts, interior of North America. Big farms, no large mammals. And the place where they've persisted, where the colors remain hot, is the Yellowstone to Yukon region. And in the north where we haven't gotten to yet. It's an amazing correspondence between those big reserves and where these large mammals survive. This is another way of looking at the landscape. It's a map by a man named Carlos Carroll. This is just where the habitat is effective versus ineffective. Red is toast. Green is really great. What do you see? Well, here's Yellowstone. There's the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, the 8 million acres de facto. There's Bob Marshall and Glacier. They bump off the map. You can actually see the nature reserves through a habitat effectiveness map without any political boundaries on it, because these places matter. And up in Canada, you can see there's quite a bit of red too. And there's Banff and Jasper in the middle. What's gone on is 100 plus years ago, this fabulous system of big reserves was put in place. So anybody talking about conservation today, like me, stands on the shoulders of giants. The people who thought the national park idea up, thought the national forest idea up, thought about protecting wilderness, thought about creating wildlife refuges. I wouldn't be here if they hadn't done that. But as great as it is, we've learned it isn't quite sufficient. If we look at wolves, for example, this wonderful painting, and a number of these paintings are from the National Museum of Wildlife Art. They were kind enough to let me use them, and we have a thing over there I'll talk about in a minute. This is the movements of one wolf, Pluie, who was radio collared near Banff National Park in the early 1990s, in 3 years of her life. So there's the Canada-US border, to orient you. Here's the Idaho Panhandle. This is Upper Montana here. There's Alberta and British Columbia. This is one wolf collared there, and this is how she traveled in her life. Another individual wolf traveled from the area she's from up to mile 0 of the Alaska Highway, and another individual wolf radio collared here traveled down to Yellowstone. One individual. If we look at pronghorn antelope, which are this wonderful icon, particularly of Wyoming, which is an astonishingly interesting animal and co-evolved with the cheetah. It's a wonderful thing. It too has vast territorial needs. So in Grand Teton Park, if you go there, this week we were there, in the evening we saw pronghorn. Well, those pronghorn are only there in Grand Teton in the summer because they can make a migration in there in the spring, up the Gros Ventre River, and into Grand Teton Park here. They can't overwinter there because there's too much snow. They die. So they have to be able to migrate back out into the Upper Green River Basin for the winter. And that's a very long migration. It's one of the longest in North America. And it's an example of how that park won't maintain pronghorn if it's not connected to the broader landscape. If something blocks that corridor, there will be no more pronghorn antelope in Grand Teton National Park, no matter how well managed that national park is. They simply won't be there because they can't spend the winter there. This is a painting by Dwayne Hardy, who is an artist I commissioned to spend 3 years painting the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor, and this is conveying the pronghorn migration out of the park. These are swans. If you go to Jackson in the winter or spring, you'll see the swans in front of on the elk refuge. Swans that winter in the Greater Yellowstone system have their babies in northern Canada and Nahanni National Park. There's actually been bands found on birds. They go up and down. That's where they live, at that scale. Golden eagles that winter in Wyoming spend their summer up in the Canadian Rockies all the way up into Alaska and come back down. That's the scale of the natural movements of this system. We didn't really know this until 20 years ago, how far they went. But that's the scale. And there's another reason we need to think about this concept of connectivity, connections, how big systems hold together. The climate is changing, and the number one recommendation from scientists is to allow nature to adapt to changing climate, is to allow species to move across the landscape. And I'm going to explain that in a little bit of detail, but there's a good clinic on it downstairs in the Draper Museum of Natural History too. This is a painting by Carl Rungus, who's well represented in your art museum upstairs. Fabulous painter of this landscape. This is Crowfoot Glacier in Banff National Park in about 1915. And you can see why it's called the Crowfoot. It's got 3 prongs, right? This is a picture I took of the Crowfoot Glacier 7 years ago. No prongs. That's how much change is going on in the 100 years of melting glaciers in this landscape. The Glacier National Park in Montana, some of you might have heard of the musician Prince, who's now known as the artist formerly known as Prince. Well, Glacier National Park, Montana may become the park formerly known as Glacier, because all the ice is melting out of that park hand over fist. It's astonishing how it's disappearing. This is climate change. So how does that relate to connectivity? Well, species, we know there was a big ice age that ended about 12,000 years ago. Glaciers were up here on the Yellowstone Plateau. They didn't make it down to Cody, but they were up higher. And you can see the glacial features if you know how to read the landscape. When that all melted out, when the climate warmed 12,000 years ago, the species marched northward, and they also march upslope. So this is looking at the Canadian Rockies. This is a large wildlife refuge on the Columbia River wetlands. And you can see the north-south structure of the landscape. Things can move up the landscape north-south. Further north you go, the cooler it gets. And also, the higher up you go, the cooler it gets. So things also move upslope, as you can see here. They can move up. You see the tree line and then the snow white. The Draper Museum is marvelously constructed to show you this. You start up high and drop down, and you can see how the ecosystem changes. If you're a pika or a pika, we call them pika where I'm from, you live in a very interesting ecological niche. You live in rock slides where it's really cool to cold. And your body temperature can't stand anything above 27 degrees Celsius. And you spend your summer farming. So you see he's got a mouthful of hay in this painting. That's what they do. They gather hay and they put it in the cracks of the rocks and they overwinter. They're very cool little animals. You might have heard them squeak. There's one downstairs. These guys live in rock slides with no trees in them. This is what happens with climate change. Trees move up slopes. This is a picture I took in Manasinabe Park. You can just see the trees marching up the slope. And how much have they marched up the slope in the last 100 years as things have been warming rapidly? This is my friend Will Rausch did his master's thesis on this tree line movement in the Canadian Rockies. So this is in Kootenay National Park in an area called the Rock Wall, where Will got some really great historical photographs that were part of a survey done. So they knew exactly where the pictures were taken, big glass plate negatives, fantastic stuff. It's like I think you had a William Henry Jackson repeat photography exhibit here, very similar. So he went to exactly the same place, got the 1906 picture. There's tree line. No trees above that point. He went back, took a picture, there's tree line. So you can see something's changed, and then he did this really, so think of it if you're a pika, okay? You live above tree line in the rocks. That's the only place you can live. So there's 1906, and then Will animated this. 2007, and then all he did is project forward the same thing, but another 80 years. No more pika habitat on that ridge, unless he can move upslope. And that's the idea of upslope connectivity, and the same thing applies going north across the landscape. It's cooler as you go north, things are going to go north. We know that, that's how it works. And there's another thing, as great as these wonderful reserves are. This is a wonderful painting of a grizzly bear in Glacier National Park, Montana. They're not big enough for grizzly bears. This graphic by Dr. Bruce McClellan is very interesting. It shows where so imagine this is the grizzly bear layer of that 14 species map I showed earlier. So this is just the one layer for grizzlies. You can see where they were in 1850, all over the place in the West. You can see where they are today in red. And you can see an island in Yellowstone. But the really interesting thing is these coffee-colored islands. That's from a 1922 study of grizzly bear distribution. Every single one of them has gone extinct. 8 million acres here was not big enough to hang on to grizzly bears in isolation from the rest of the landscape. That's the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. No bears in there. And Yellowstone is very, very vulnerable because it's become an island. So the reason we started this Yellowstone to Yukon idea is to talk about let's restore these connections through here to there, and let's not sever the connections. Look how vulnerable that peninsula is coming down the Canadian Rockies. Canada is surprisingly not just a vast horde of Eskimos and fur traders. We're actually a very busy industrial society of 34 million people, producing all kinds of commodities, and we have big cities and everything else up there. And if we have to be just as conscious as you do about how we manage the landscape, or we'll lose it. This is the peninsula coming down the Canadian Rockies into Waterton Glacier, Bob Marshall. There's Yellowstone. So the idea is to reconnect this whole system and not have what happened in Colorado, for example, where grizzly bears dropped out in the 1960s. California state flag is what? It's a grizzly bear. Why? They had grizzly bears in California until 1949, and the last one went extinct. So this is the idea, to think about this landscape as a region, as a whole. Not as just the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, as important as that idea is, but as a region that hangs together and lives together or falls apart if it becomes fragmented. And that's the goal of the Yellowstone to Yukon idea. How we can live together in this big region and think about it as a whole. And one of the big challenges of fragmentation, or chopping up the landscape, is highways. So I'm going to take you to here. This is Highway 3, which is just north of the Canada-US border. It's in southern Canada. And has the potential to make all of the United States one big island. If we fragment the habitat along that road, all of the carnivore populations in this part of the world would become isolated, and the drum roll of extinction follows. Chris Servine, who's a friend of mine who's the head of grizzly bear recovery for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, said what happens on Highway 3 in southern Canada will determine the future of large carnivores in the United States. Now, if you're a Canadian and you're thinking about this in isolation, what do you care? A lot of country up there. If you're a good neighbor, you should care a lot about what happens below the line. And I'm hoping to be a good neighbor, and Yellowstone to Yukon thinks that we need to be good neighbors. And so I want to tell you about some of the efforts we're making on this Highway 3 to maintain the ability of animals to move across the landscape. So this is Highway 3 in the Crow's Nest Pass area of Alberta, right near the British Columbia border. See, it's a road, heavy traffic. It's not an interstate level road, but it's a busy road. Still gets used by these guys. There it is with an even finer grain. So this is a map of grizzly bear distribution at a finer scale than the last one from my friend Mike Proctor. So here you can see Highway 3 in bright red. And you can actually see that peninsula that looked pretty good in red is actually 3 fingers. And there's already nothing in between those fingers. In other words, nothing can live there. So, and we actually know here where it says K on Selkirk, there is a wall of housing across here that the bears on this side of where it says K and it says M are already genetically different. That's already broken apart. So we're focusing a lot of effort on keeping a connection through here with a view to restoring a connection through there, with a view to restoring a population here and that connection there. And we're also working very hard on making sure this is never severed, because this is the sort of the mother lode that still exists. So I'm going to take you into this Purcell Yak area and give you a sense of what the fine-grained large landscape conservation work comes to. This is Mike Proctor, a grizzly bear biologist, on a parcel of land that he identified that we should buy. 390 acres. The grizzly bears come off the ridge from up there and come through this territory. You'll notice it's not in a wilderness condition. That's okay. It's about the ability of the animals to move through it. It's not about making a national park. It's about what's called permeability. This is Mike's research showing the individual movements of individual grizzly bears. So imagine we're inside that middle finger, and this is all the bears and all they're doing to move across that. And what you can see is, while that finger looked pretty wide, it's actually got further subdivisions where it's very, very narrow indeed. And here's the big mother lode right here at Kid Creek. The green dot is a bear, the yellow dot is a different bear, the red dot's a bear, and each of them is individual different bears. This is where they're moving through. These are private lands. This area here was going to be turned into a trailer park, 80-acre trailer park. But the landowner was very concerned that he would rather sell it into conservation. So we made a deal, literally over a kitchen table, to buy this 80 acres, and we were able to close and buy that land. We're now talking with the farmer who owns this parcel, and we bought that other parcel where Mike was standing on, and the picture is this one, and we bought it. And the idea is to keep this land permeable, not to turn it into a national park, but just keep it permeable. So this huge idea of Yellowstone to Yukon, over 1,000 miles long, 2,000 miles long, comes down to 80 acres, 300 acres of fine-grained analysis on the connectivity side. That's Kid Creek. So we're keeping that linkage intact, and then we're focusing here at the Yak Kootenai because there's a gap between this recovery zone in the United States for bears and an island population here in the Cabinet Yak. And we're also buying parcels here. We just are closing this week on the purchase of this parcel. You can see there's only a few pieces of private land, and we're trying to pick them up, always with the agreement of the landowner. so that we can secure them for conservation to keep the whole system together. And the big idea, of course, is that the parcels up here and the parcels that we're buying there allow this kind of a flow of life back into that big 8 million acres of the Subway Bitterroot, ultimately back into Yellowstone. And similarly, is a wonderful big deal been done by the Nature Conservancy of Montana that fits into this vision, connecting the Bob Marshall Wilderness and Glacier across through here around Missoula. It's called the Montana Legacy Project, which is actually the biggest conservation deal ever done in the world with private land. So what we've been able to do as a community is work together in a shared vision. And we work with all of these individual land trusts to enable their work as best we can. We help them fundraise, we help talk about priorities, to buy parcels in those critical places. And this is the largest collaboration of land trusts going on anywhere in the world as well. And it's been very, very effective. And so our idea has become, over the course of the 19 years, sort of a mainstream idea. These are kind of, Chuck will tell you, you get in an editorial in Nature magazine, you're a happy guy. It's the most prestigious natural history publication in the world, science publication. And this is their editorial from January. Yellowstone is the archetype for park as an island. As corridor ecology has taken off as a scientific subfield, so have corridor connectivity projects like Yellowstone to Yukon. And this is from America's Great Outdoors, which is all the federal agencies blessed by the President. This is from Appendix D in that document. Yellowstone to Yukon has become the example that people look to all over the world about thinking at this scale. And again, it's got a lot to do with the fact that we're dealing with Yellowstone to Yukon, not just our cleverness. We're dealing with a landscape where we had a lot of stuff to begin working with. Many places it's much more difficult than it is here. And one of the things we've done is outreach, trying to reach out to the world in various ways, and we've been pretty successful. And of course, you have a wonderful photo show in the Draper now by Florian Schultz, who was a young German who was inspired by stories about the wild nature, especially a German writer named Karl May, who was in love with the Yukon, who inspires many Germans to come into this landscape. And Florian came with his camera and did a spectacular job. You might wonder why I'm here instead of him, given it's his photo show. Well, he's suffering in Mexico at the moment. And it's his field season, so that's what he's doing. And just in case you think field seasons are always fun, that's his Arctic field season. And those are mosquitoes. Those are not spilled coffee. So he works hard for those pictures, and he does a really good job. But it's kind of interesting to think more profoundly about the origins of an idea like Yellowstone to Yukon, beyond the science and the stories I've told you. People have known for a long time that this is one big landscape. And there's an artist who's very well represented upstairs in your art gallery named Carl Rungus, who's also represented in the Draper Museum, he's the Michelangelo of wildlife and wilderness art in North America, 20th century. He's the guy. And he painted from Yellowstone to Yukon 100 years ago. He started out in Cora, Wyoming. Then he fell in love with Banff and the Canadian Rockies, set up a studio and lived there every summer for 50 years. He painted on the Peace River, and he painted in the Yukon Territory. And his work is very important because not only is it spectacularly wonderful, this man was painting wildlife before cameras could take pictures of wildlife. Because you remember the pictures of the ancestors with the headrests keeping their heads still? Ask a bear to do that. He's not gonna. So this is him in an older stage with a pronghorn antelope painting of the Wind River area, the Upper Green in Wyoming. This is one of his paintings called In His Prime, which I think is a reflection on the artist too, of under Mount Rundle in Banff National Park near his studio. And I got the idea that it would be fun to have a modern artist who had respect for the past to paint from Yellowstone to the Yukon in the present, so that we could see how the landscape is now through the eyes of an artist. And I met this fellow, Dwayne Hardy, who was giving an art lecture in Montana 6 or 7 years ago. He's a great student of Carl Rungus and also Lilius Fors and Kunert, who are great artists from Europe. And here he is holding a book by Sheldon about an expedition to the Yukon that Carl Rungus illustrated 110 years ago when they were trying to figure out the color variations in thin-horned sheep populations. And so we sent him out for 3 years to paint the landscape, and we ended up with this show that if you go from here to Jackson, you can see at the National Museum of Wildlife Art, called Yellowstone to Yukon, The Journey of Wildlife and Art. And we've told this story through art as a way of reaching people in a different way. That's what the museum looks like, but they've taken all the rocks down because they're replacing it, but it's still open and you can go in. And you'll see an image from that show that the Jackson Hole Chamber of Commerce has embraced as their Fall Arts Festival image. This is a special painting called Strength and Vulnerability of Bear 399 by Dwayne, and they'll auction this off in the fall at their big arts festival. And Bear 399 has actually had 3 cubs last year, and people could see her all the time, and she's had 3 cubs again, and my friend Kent Nelson just sent me a picture of her and 3 cubs, and you can actually see Bear 399 kind of like this if you go to the Grand Teton Park right now. But of course, even before artists like Carl Rungus or Dwayne, there were Aboriginal people who were painting nature, painting wildlife in the landscape. This is from near Dubois. If you've ever seen the petroglyphs, see the animal with the horns or antlers there? Another one here. These are just pecked into the rock, and they're obviously very old, or there wouldn't be lichens growing over them. And this is an Aboriginal perspective of wildlife. This is a wolf painting by an Aboriginal artist. And you can see the inherent respect and the spiritual connection to nature that Aboriginal people feel through this painting. If we go up the Yellowstone to Yukon system, one of the neat things about it is that we still have Aboriginal people living in the system, very close to here, and all the way up the system. It's one of the special qualities of the area. And I'm going to take you up to the Nahanni. So that's this area here, which is, you'll remember I said the swans that winter in Yellowstone have their babies. That's where they have their babies. This is a woman named Elsie Marcellet who was born in a tent on the Nahanni River. She does not speak English. She only speaks Slavey. And you can see her artwork in her hands. It's birch bark baskets with porcupine quills that she's dyed, and there she's done a lovely bluebird with a wild rose. So they're still practicing traditional arts. She lives in a town called Nahanni Butte. And this is upstream. This is the Cirque of the Unclimbables in the South Nahanni watershed. It has walls of granite as significant as the ones in Yosemite. This is the Ram River in the Nahanni system. And you'll be reminded of the Colorado Plateau. There are multiple canyons in that area. The deepest one is a mile deep, as deep as the Grand Canyon. There's boreal forests with karst topography that the lakes actually drain subterraneanly. And there's a waterfall twice as high as Niagara. Remind you a little bit, perhaps, of the lower falls of the Yellowstone. And there's a national park there that was created to prevent a hydro dam from taking over this in the 1970s. But the park was just that big, basically protected the river from hydro. So we set out to make the park the whole watershed. And the whole watershed, to give you an idea of scale, would be start at Yellowstone Lake and go to Billings. Keep going a little further. That's how big the whole watershed is. Real big place. And then throw in the river here as it goes up. And that's the Ram River. So that gives you a sense of scale. So this park here is in between Glacier Park and Yellowstone in size in the old. And we worked to get this whole watershed into a national park. And one of the things done, this is from the Wildlife Conservation Society, a good friend, John Weaver, did a bunch of field work and showed there's the park, but there's where the Dull Sheep Range is. This is where science really matters. Here's where the woodland caribou in black spend their time. And there's where the grizzly bears hang out. And you could see the old park boundary, as wonderful as it was for the river, for those 3 species, wasn't so hot. So we worked very hard through the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society with the Park Service, the superintendent standing up, and that's the Grand Chief of the Decho First Nation, Herb Norwegian, to convince Canadians we should make a national park out of the whole watershed. And this is what happened in June last year. This is the head of Canada's Park Service and me at the ceremony where we got 96% of the Decho portion of the watershed in a national park. 9 million acres. So Yellowstone's 2.2 million acres. So it's 3.5 Yellowstones. And we're very close, I hope, to getting this headwaters area also in a national park that would be the same size as Yellowstone. And that we're, knock on wood, hoping will happen very soon. And to commemorate that, we did a neat thing. We took Dwayne, the artist, who's the commissioned guy, down the river along with a bunch of us who'd worked on the campaign on a celebratory trip. And this is how art happens. This is a plein air painting. Plein air is French for outdoors. And here he is standing on top of this cliff that he wasn't sure he wanted to go up, that Mary-Eve and I dragged him up, doing a plein air painting above the canyons of the Nahanni. And you can see him working away there. It takes him about 3 hours. That's a close-up of the brushes. And this is how those wonderful things upstairs get started. And there's the painting halfway through. And then they bring the painting back when it's done, take it in the studio, and that's what the final image looks like. So that's the process behind those paintings that you see in this wonderful museum. And this plein air Dwayne did on the banks of the Nahanni near Nahanni Butte. And it's of Nahanni Butte. And if you go downstairs, you can see a beaver lodge. And this mountain looks a lot like a beaver lodge. And in fact, there's a wonderful story about how art has this power to connect people to nature that I want to share with you. The superintendent of Nahanni Park is a man named Chuck Blythe. If you've seen Steve Herrero's Bear Attacks, Their Causes and Avoidance, Chuck did the illustrations in that book. So I know he likes art. So we brought Dwayne in to the superintendent's office with these plein air paintings with, pine needles in them and everything still wet, and put them all out, 15 or so plein airs. And one of the guys who works in the park is Jonas Antoine. And he's a Decho elder. So this guy is an Aboriginal man, Dene Aboriginal man from that area. And he grabbed that painting, and I just happened to have my camera, took this picture, and he started talking about it. He says, this is Nahanni Butte. In our culture, this is a beaver lodge. And this is Beaver Lodge is a place where Yamoria, who is our Moses, who gave their laws here on this tufa mound upstream in Nahanni National Park called Rabbit Kettle Hot Springs, or Yamoria's dinner plate. He gave the Dene their laws to live by, like the 10 Commandments. And he came down the valley to protect the Dene from the giant beavers that were terrorizing the people who lived in that lodge. And the giant beavers, big teeth, were killing the people. And Yamoria came down, chased the beavers out of that lodge, and got rid of them, and made this place safe for the people. So, Indian legend, huh? Well, downstairs you got some Pleistocene mammal skulls. This is from the museum in Yellowknife. That is a giant beaver skull. That's a current beaver skull. These things were as big as black bears, 200 pounds plus. And I don't know if you follow the news, but recently a beaver killed a couple of dogs. Beaver that big have no trouble killing somebody. These people just remember Pleistocene mammals. That's how long they've been in the landscape. And it's turned into stories, just like Western world's myths have become stories, but they're still true. And it's just amazing to have contact with a culture in situ that dates thousands and thousands of years that can remember Pleistocene mammals. And the art is what provoked him to tell that story. And just to give you a sense of scale, this is a modern day human. This is from they just found a big mammoth graveyard basically near the ski hill in Aspen at Snowmass. And this is from their visitor center. See the human scale? Look how big the buffalo used to be. And the sloths and stuff. These people just remember something that's no longer with us. So from this vast Nahanni, there's the old park boundary, there's the new one. It's big and wonderful. And I'm going to bring you back down to the other issue that's with us, and that's highway systems. So in addition to housing, we have issues of how animals get across busy, busy roads. And in Banff Park, an innovation was developed to avoid roadkill on an extremely busy highway. And these highway overpasses with fences that allow animals to cross the road in safety. This is what they look like when they're under construction. That's what they look like on top. And they monitor them. This guy's got a rake, and he rakes that gravel bed there back every day and keeps track of what crosses. And this is still a photograph of a grizzly bear crossing one of those structures. a lynx. And there's also underpasses. This is an interesting encounter called neither one of us wants to be there kind of a picture. And 220,000 individual animal movements have gone through the Trans-Canada Highway in Banff Park in the last 15 years. Phenomenally successful. And the neat thing is, these are being replicated now on the Kootenay Salish Reservation between Missoula and Glacier Park. And they're actually modeled on Banff Park. They did an EIS say, you give us one of those and one of those, or you can't put your road through our reservation. And in Pinedale, to accommodate this pronghorn migration, you can see these things under construction just north of Pinedale right now. So we're having 3 sets of these in the Yellowstone Yukon region. Only place in Western North America like that, where the system's doing that. So we have lots of reasons to smile. Lots of reasons to feel good about the Yellowstone Yukon area, including my happy times with my wife, eating blueberries and things. But if we scale out to the world, there's an additional responsibility and a different way to think about this as I conclude. This is a very special part of the world. And often we have a tendency to talk about being save the best of the last. Help us, give us your resources so we can do this because everything else is toast. Well, actually, the world is the scale of the system. There is no part of the world that's isolated from any other. And this is the sad reality of what's going on with our world, which is the resilience of many ecosystems is likely to be surpassed by climate change, drought, habitat destruction, all the things going on, land use change, pollution, and so on. We are overwhelming the world because we're not living within its capacities. This painting, how many people know this painting? Okay, it's called The Scream. And it's one of the most popular images in the world right now because it expresses the way especially young people feel about the world now. We have not largely given this generation hope. We have to. We have to get back into the business of hope. And one of the most, we don't have the only cool animals in the world. Right? This is a tiger I photographed in Bandhavgarh National Park in India, in a little island park. And people in Nepal and India are trying desperately to restore connectivity between their reserves. And in fact, there's a whole family of initiatives around the world, like Yellowstone to Yukon, going on that I'm proud to say we've helped inspire. Here's one from Spain and Western France and Italy, where they have brown bears and wolves still in Spain. It's wilder than Colorado, Spain. Here's one from India and Nepal, where they're trying to hook up tiger and elephant reserves. Here's Australia, the great eastern ranges of Australia. And Australia is looking at a national connectivity strategy. This is where hope lies. We can actually organize ourselves as a species to share the world with all the other species. And there's a whole community of people from around the world working on this together. And I want to leave you with this thought and this image from India, actually. This is a picture I took on the banks of a river in the Indian Himalaya, right out the back of a tailor shop where I was having a shirt made and I was waiting. And the tailor had dumped all these wonderful pieces of fabric by the river, and the river had worked them and washed them a little bit. And this image was there, and it's kind of a reflection of the state of our world. It's still very beautiful, but it's a bit tattered. And we need to do better than that. And we can do better than that. And the way we can do better than that is by living with nature, allowing these big flows, keeping connectivity in the landscape, and that'll make it a world that we want to live in and a world that we can be proud that our grandchildren inherit. And thank you so much for your attention tonight.